In this video, we're going to be talking about the categories of employment and the paperwork you're going to be filling out when you take a job. When you are a working musician, you will generally encounter two categories of employment. Category 1 is when you are self-employed, also known as freelance, and another fancy word, independent contractor. Category 2 is being an employee. Let's unpack the differences. Let's start with Category 2, employee. You are considered an employee when you encounter the following things in your job. When you receive a regular paycheck, like weekly or monthly or bi-weekly, you have a regular schedule, 9 to 5, 8 to 1, or some semblance of regularity, even if it's a couple times a week or a couple times a month. There are taxes taken out of your paycheck, which we will talk about later. And when you are an employee, you are aligned with a company. And that has to do with the liability of that company. That company takes you under its wing. It decides you are part of its team. And it assumes a certain level of liability and ownership when it decides to employ you. You guys sign the contract, you sign all of the paperwork. Some examples of being an employee in a working musician's world are working for a Broadway orchestra or a musical theater gig of some regularity somewhere. A teaching job, if you work at a university or a school, or even if you're teaching maybe 1 day a week, 2 days a week, a couple days every 2 weeks. If it's a regular teaching job, you're an employee. And obviously the same goes for academia. A cruise ship, or if you're working for a production company that puts on shows or hires musicians. Or any kind of part-time job. Maybe you're working for a record label part-time doing some kind of admin work. Anything that's regular, where you're getting a regular paycheck and there are taxes taken out of that paycheck, you're an employee. Now let's look at being self-employed. Self-employed literally means being employed by yourself. You are your employer. You're the one calling the shots. Some characteristics of being self-employed include being paid once. You do one-off gigs. That event planner only hires you once for one wedding during the summer, or maybe a couple of sporadic weddings throughout the summer, which means you're paid on an irregular schedule, which also results in you making your own hours. Again, you're calling the shots. You're the boss. You also decide, or you negotiate, your pay. We're going to talk more about negotiation and what you should charge in another video, but when you are self-employed, you are the one who is deciding how much you're making. Yeah, when you're an employee, you can negotiate a salary, but it's not the same. You're not the one driving the bus. Self-employed workers are also responsible for themselves. And again, this boils down to liability. When you are self-employed, you are the boss. You are the one who's responsible for your well-being and the well-being of your gear, all of your insurance, and all of the little things that come along with liability. In fact, you will often have to fill out paperwork when you are going to be working as a self-employed entity for another company that absolves them of responsibility for certain things involving your work so that they don't have to be liable. More on that later. Some examples of self-employed gigs include wedding gigs, private parties, private teaching from your own home. You're calling the shots, you're running the company. Being a guest artist at a university or with some kind of a jazz festival. If you get a composition commission or you're doing copy work, that's sort of irregular and gig to gig or contract to contract. Touring. Venues are going to be paying you in some kind of a lump sum. They're not going to take you on as an employee because you played somewhere one night. And just gigs in general. So these two categories might seem self-explanatory, but the nitty-gritty happens when you sign the paperwork that defines you as either an employee or someone who is self-employed. And that's what we're about to get into. Here's how the paperwork breaks down. When you are an employee, your employer will ask you to fill out what's called a W-4 form. This is all of your personal information, your address, your name, your social. You're going to have to check a bunch of boxes, ask an accountant on how to fill out a W-4 form, and then you're going to have to sign it. It's basically an agreement with the company that they and you are going to be adhering to the rules of the IRS with regards to taxes. You might also have to fill out an I-9 form, which proves your citizenship or your status in the US, any company paperwork, and then of course a contract. But the important form to remember here is your W-4. Let's move on to self-employed. When you are working as a gig worker on one-off contracts, you will often encounter being asked to fill out a W-9 form. This is very similar to the W-4 form, except you're not going to be checking off as many boxes. It's basically just your personal information with your social security number, and you have to sign. But again, it's an agreement that says that you are going to be doing work with someone under the jurisdiction of the IRS. In addition, you'll probably sign a contract. And also, remember when I mentioned liability? Whoever you're going to be working with might ask you to sign an independent contractor form or independent contractor waiver. This basically absolves that company of responsibility when they're hiring you to do that gig. Again, we'll talk about that in a minute. But the important thing to remember here is W-9. That is the form that defines your work as being self-employed. Just like the W-4 form defines your work as being that of an employee when you're signing on with a company to do regular employment. So let's fast forward a little bit to the end of the year. If you were an employee of a company doing regular work, getting a regular paycheck, getting taxes taken out of the paycheck, and you signed that W-4 form, which defined you as an employee with that company, at the end of the calendar year, usually in January of the next year, you will receive what's called a W-2 form. This W-2 form is a statement of all of the money that you made, and it also includes the amount of money that was taken out of your paycheck for taxes. Medicare, Social Security, state, federal, etc., etc. This form has been reported to the IRS. So the IRS knows how much you made with this company. It's basically the company's way of stating, we had an employee, this is how much we paid them, and this is how much came out of their paycheck in taxes when we gave them their paychecks throughout the year. It's a very important statement. And when you work for that one employer, you should receive one W-2 form. Now, when you're self-employed and you're doing many gigs for various amounts of money, and you have most likely signed W-9 forms, which were the forms that defined you as being self-employed for that employer, at the end of the calendar year, most likely in January, you will receive what's called a 1099 form. The 1099 is a statement of all of the money that you made for one singular employer. For instance, if you played one solo cocktail piano gig for a restaurant and they paid you $750 and they asked you to fill out that W-9 form, at the end of the year, you're going to receive a 1099 form with that company's info on there, your info, and a statement that you were paid $750 that previous year. Now, if you were asked to perform twice and you made $1,400 with that restaurant or hotel, then at the end of the year, your 1099 would say $1,400. You're not going to get individual 1099s based on individual gigs you did for one employer. However, when you are self-employed, you do work for many different people. It's not uncommon for me to receive 20, 30, even 40 1099 forms at the end of the year because I'm doing contract work for many different people. Schools, festivals, private parties, contract work of all kinds. So all of those employers are keeping track of how much money they paid me, and they send me that 1099 at the end of the year, which is that statement of how much money I made in total from that employer. Just like the W-2 form, that money has been reported to the IRS, and the IRS knows that money was made and exchanged hands. And another thing to note, you will not receive a 1099 form if you made less than $600 for anyone in that calendar year. The threshold for receiving a 1099 form is $600 or more from that calendar year. The IRS doesn't want to deal with every tiny little thing. If you did a gig for $100 once, they don't want to be dealing with paperwork for 1099s for all these tiny little amounts of money. So the threshold's $600. So if you made $600 or more from someone, expect a 1099 at the end of the year. So just so we're straight, when you're an employee, you'll fill out a W-4 form, which will result in a W-2 form at the end of the year. If you're self-employed, you'll be signing W-9 forms, which will result in 1099 forms at the end of the year if you were paid $600 or more from any one of those employers. And again, you might receive many 1099s because you're going to be doing many gigs. Story time. This story is going to hammer home how important it is to understand the paperwork that you're signing when you engage in employment with companies. I was asked by an organization to put together a jazz trio for a private event. When we were working out the contract and the payment, they also sent me a W-4 form to fill out. I didn't know the difference between a W-4 and a W-9. Now the thing is, when you're a band leader, just like I was going to be for this event, the deal is I receive the full paycheck and then have to pay my band X, Y, and Z, however much I'm paying them. So if I'm going to do that, I need to receive the entire lump sum of money. Plus, I wasn't working for this company in any regular way whatsoever. This was a one-off gig. But whoever was onboarding me had me sign a W-4 form and basically onboarded me with the company as an employee, because they probably weren't really aware that an independently contracted person who's just doing a gig needs to sign a W-9 form. Well, you can imagine what happened. We negotiated the gig. I think we got like $1,500 or something. And I paid my band people like $400 or $500 each or whatever I paid them. And then when I got the paycheck for the gig in the mail, the paycheck had taxes taken out, which was basically my entire share of what I would have made on the gig. And so I called the company and I was like, look, you can't take taxes out when you're hiring a band leader who has to pay people out of that paycheck. And we ended up straightening it out. They ended up paying me extra, but they still had to take taxes out of that. Anyway, it was kind of a bit of a mess. But that was the lesson that I learned, that if you are a band leader and you're going to be subcontracting and hiring other musicians, you need to be paid as if you are your own entity, as if you are your own business. Because technically, generally speaking, employees are not allowed to hire other people to work underneath them. So that's why your employment as a band leader needs to be categorized as self-employed, and you need to be filling out the W-9 instead of the W-4, or else you're going to get a big surprise when that check comes in the mail. Now let's talk a little bit about liability. Liability basically means who's responsible for what when it hits the fan. When you're an employee, by and large, your employer is responsible for you and your well-being while you're working that job. But it's very specific to the job. If you get injured while you are doing job-related things and you're an employee, chances are that employer has to help you file workers' compensation claims and has to be privy to making sure you're compensated in some way for the injuries that you sustained. Your employer also has to buy the tools of the trade. Oftentimes when people start a corporate job, they get a corporate laptop and a corporate phone, the company car. Now, liability when you're self-employed means you are responsible for yourself, your well-being. You are responsible for your tools of your trade and insuring all of your instruments and making sure that you're covered. You've got to buy all of your own tools and your reeds and your valve oil and your manuscript paper, technology gear, whatever you need to do the thing that you do. You have to deal with your own retirement, your own health insurance, dental, whatever you want to do there. You don't have an employer contributing to any of that for you. And you are considered an independent contractor. Now, this is a technical term that defines you as self-employed in the eyes of somebody who's going to be contracting you to do work for them. And oftentimes your employer, who asks you to fill out that W-9 form, will also have you fill out an independent contractor form, which basically states that you are your own company, you are independent from your client or the company that's hiring you, you are not going to hold them liable if something happens to you, you aren't expecting any benefits, and you're acknowledging that no taxes are being taken out of your paycheck. I ran a nonprofit organization where I sent musicians into nursing homes and care facilities to do live performances. But when I hired musicians, I needed to make sure that my company was protected. So we made sure that everybody who was employed through us to perform signed an independent contractor waiver, and you can see a portion of it here. The middle paragraph says, the independent contractor agrees to indemnify Groove Trail, which means hold Groove Trail harmless, its officers, employees, agents, volunteer hosts, successors, or assigns harmless from liabilities, claims, costs, and expenses incident to any claim, loss, damage, expense, or injury to the person or property of the independent contractor or to the person or property of any employees, subagents, which means band members that they might sub-hire, volunteer hosts, or any person through the acts, omissions, or negligence of the independent contractor or any of his, her employees or subagents. The independent contractor hereby agrees to indemnify and hold Groove Trail harmless from any and all liabilities, claims, costs, including reasonable attorney's fees. So this paragraph basically was like, Groove Trail, which is my organization, says, I'm not responsible for you. We're paying you X amount of money. You're going to go do the gig, and that's what it's going to be. And you're responsible for yourself. You're responsible if you're going to sub-hire somebody. You're responsible for your gear, for your own health and well-being. You will not be suing us. This is a one-off thing. You're not an employee, etc., etc. So if you get one of these forms, don't freak out. That's basically all it says. Oftentimes, contracts themselves have a clause in them that says something about being an independent contractor, or another word for that is work for hire. You might see that too. That basically alludes to independent contractor as well. So in review, when you're an employee, a regular employee getting a regular paycheck, you sign a W-4, which results in a W-2 income statement at the end of the year. And if you're self-employed, doing one-off gigs, you will fill out a W-9 form, which results in a 1099 form if you made $600 or more through that one employer throughout that calendar year. And you will also be asked, most likely, to sign some kind of a contract or independent contractor waiver that absolves that company from responsibility for you and your gear. I'll see you in the next video.